What we forgot about the Great Plague of the 14th century when COVID came along. During New Zealand's COVID pandemic, I worked as a vaccinator for the Immunisation Health Authority, vaccinating just under 10,000 individuals. This experience highlighted my interest in pandemics and the history of their control by public health measures. Here is a very brief reminder about the COVID pandemic that started late in 2019. In December of that year, a laboratory in Wuhan, China, advised the World Health Organization of an unusual pneumonia, the source of which was uncertain. Whether it had come from a laboratory or the community was not sure. In January the next year, the World Health Organization declared a global health emergency, and New Zealand took that on notice when the first case arrived here in February that year. New Zealand had its first death in March of that year, and a 4-tier alert system was introduced. Lockdowns became part of life, and the first one occurred from March to May of 2020. During that time, COVID tracing, border controls, compulsory mask wearing were all introduced with the goal of eliminating the disease. By March 2021, there were 10,000 fully vaccinated New Zealanders and 40,000 who were partially vaccinated, and over the ensuing 2 years, 84% of the population became fully vaccinated. It became clear, however, that by August 2021, that elimination of COVID was going to be futile, and that strategy was abandoned, and full vaccination was the aim. Over time, up until early 2022, border restrictions were gradually eased. In September of that year, most of the COVID rules were reduced, and in August of 2023, all COVID restrictions ceased. Overall in New Zealand, there were 2.25 million cases with just over 12,000 deaths. But the point to make is that COVID is still around. In May of 2024, I had the pleasure and privilege to travel between Venice and London via about 14 towns and cities to see the legacies of the 14th century plague which afflicted Europe. Recently, there has been a public inquiry into New Zealand's management of the COVID pandemic. This presentation describes the lessons we may have forgotten from medieval times about the control such outbreaks and reflects on and compares the responses to the pandemic by New Zealand and the United States of America. There have been a number of plagues in the last 2 millennia. The first was the Justinian plague in the 5th century after Christ. The Black Death, which I'm talking about now, was quite brief and killed about 50% of Europe's population. A later Italian plague, I shall also mention, killed 1/3 of Venetians, and the Great Plague of London in 1665, over 1 year, killed 100,000 people. Most recently, 15 million people died in Yunnan and India in the Great Plague of the 19th century. European society was in great turmoil in the 14th century. The final dissolution of the Roman, Byzantine and Ottoman empires had occurred, and the 100 Years' War occupied most of that century. The Roman Catholic Church saw a seismic shift with the administration of the church moving from Rome to Avignon for most of that century. There was famine, there was abject poverty, a mini ice age and other climatic changes as well. The so-called Black Death probably started in Crimea about 1345, and within 7 years it had decimated 25% of Europe's population. For uncertain reasons, the plague then died out, but as most know, there were subsequent epidemics of the plague. As mentioned, the mortality rate was very high, and it particularly affected the large urban centres, Florence, Rome, Venice. The wealthy had recourse to their country estates and retreated there to escape the disease. Work mostly ceased because there was no labour force, the middle and lower classes being particularly affected by the disease. Church activities ceased for two reasons. Firstly, priests were first-line carers for the sufferers of the plague, and secondly, as mentioned previously, there was a great dislocation in church activity because of the move of the Avignon papacy. There were significant later effects from the plague. Economic and social effects were quite profound. The wage structure changed entirely because of the diminution in the labour force. The working class were able to demand more wages, which the wealthy, having more disposable income, were happy to oblige. However, they were not too happy about the ability for lower classes to dress better and appear to be more elevated in status than they were. So laws were passed in some towns to stop that. It is fair to say that the plague had a profound effect on the faith of many people. They could not believe that a benign deity would afflict the community with such a serious event as the plague. So art and architecture became more secular and religious themes diminished. The church was profoundly affected. As mentioned, the Avignon papacy had moved and many priests died after caring for the sick. So a number of people took on the role of priests without proper religious education. Jews were sadly persecuted. They were nomadic and also had a cross immunity to the plague, which was partial, probably occasioned by their susceptibility to various Mediterranean anemias. Therefore, they were blamed for the plague and, in some cases, severely persecuted. All the items mentioned on this slide were apparent during the 14th century. The next slide will talk about quarantine and social distancing. Mask wearing became common, but we would not recognise them as the masks that we've worn today. Lockdowns, regulations and government support I shall address in later slides, but it was apparent throughout all these episodes that strong leadership mattered. Quarantine derives for the Latin for 40 days, and the place of quarantine in Venice were the Lazaretto Islands, which subsequently gave its name for a place of refuge from the plague throughout Italy. The old Lazaretto Vecchio, was for caring for plague victims, but subsequently the new Lazaretto Islands were where ships had to moor for 40 days before they came into port, and that eventually became a hospital. Today we are well aware of how plague works. It is carried by the fleas that live on the rats. But this was unknown in the 14th century, and the cause of the plague was believed to be airborne by a miasma. Social distancing was therefore important. And on the left of the slide, you can see a man dressed in the mask, which has a beak. Inside the mask were the flowers. And on the right-hand slide is a photograph I took of a perfumery in Grasse, southern France, where perfumed masks were made during the plague. In his right hand, he carries a stick, but that is to measure the distance between plague victims and was an early attempt at social distancing. It often had a bell attached to it. The later Italian plague particularly was prominent in the northern central part of Italy, and in a small town called Ferrara, a Spanish doctor, the equivalent of a medical officer of health, introduced strict border controls. He ensured proper sanitary laws relating to personal hygiene were in effect. He badgered the church and the government for financial redress for farmers who had lost stock to the plague, bearing in mind that animals suffered from the plague as much as humans. If you admitted you had the plague, you were not penalised. But if you broke the rules, there were always the gallows. However, during that plague, there were no deaths in Ferrara. And the photograph shows the frontispiece of the book that he wrote, setting out the regulations. So did we learn anything from the 14th century? Well, some did not, and this is a title paper from an international journal of medicine, a history of medicine, which was published in 2022. It can be seen that there were many lessons from the 14th century that were forgotten by many countries when COVID arrived in late 2019. It is possible that political positions in some countries may have worsened the outcomes for both the plague and COVID. In our times, it is estimated that up to 100,000 people died in various countries because of the belief in herd immunity for this disease, which proved to be wrong. There was a lot of criticism of governments, but it is important to bear in mind that when one takes precautions, nothing much happens. And when precautions are effective, it is understandable that the population, when everything seems to go on as normal, will say that the government's overstepped the mark. It is important, however, to bear in mind that we need to be better prepared for the inevitable next pandemic. Thank you very much.